In the sweltering heat of early June 1876, a holy man danced under the blinding sun until he bled. Sitting Bull, the spiritual heart of the Hunkpapa Lakota, stood at the center of the camp and offered a profound physical sacrifice to the Creator. 50 small pieces of flesh were sliced from his arms. Enduring the pain, he danced into a deep trance. And in that trance, a chilling vision came to him. He saw soldiers, on horseback, falling into his camp upside down, like grasshoppers dropping from the sky. In the vision, their hats had fallen off. They had no ears. The Lakota people surrounding him understood the prophecy immediately. The soldiers were coming. They would not listen, and they would die. Days later, George Armstrong Custer led the Seventh Cavalry across the rugged ridges of the Montana Territory, riding directly into the mouth of that exact vision. They were an elite force, but the plains had taken their toll. Their wool trousers and flannel shirts were deeply caked in thick dirt and dried mud from relentless river crossings and the choking dust of a forced march. They were exhausted, thirsty, and entirely unaware that they were not the hunters they believed themselves to be. They were an offering. For over a century, history books and sweeping oil paintings have presented what happened next as Custer's last stand, a heroic, defensive ring of brave men fighting against impossible odds. But if you look past the propaganda, down into the blood-soaked mud of the Little Bighorn, the archaeology and the oral histories reveal a terrifying truth. There was no last stand. It was a catastrophic collapse, and the horrifying things done to the soldiers' bodies after the gunfire stopped, that was not mindless, random savagery. It was a deliberate system of spiritual disarmament. To understand why an entire United States Army command was systematically taken apart, you have to realize that Custer did not ride into an ambush. He rode onto an altar, and it was an altar that Custer himself had helped build. 2 years earlier, in 1874, Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills of South Dakota. This was land absolutely guaranteed to the Lakota Sioux by the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. It was the sacred center of their world. But Custer's expedition confirmed the presence of gold, and that single announcement triggered a massive, uncontrollable rush of miners into Lakota territory. Instead of enforcing the treaty and removing the trespassers, the United States government issued a devastating ultimatum. All Lakota bands must report to designated reservations by the 31st of January 1876. Those who refused to surrender their ancestral lands were officially branded as hostiles. The army was dispatched to force compliance. But the people gathering along the sprawling floodplain of the Little Bighorn River in the early summer of 1876 did not see themselves as hostile combatants. They were families. Among the immense circle of hide lodges were old men, women, children, and entire extended kinship groups from the Northern Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and multiple Lakota bands. They had gathered not to wage a war of conquest, but for community, for the annual Sundance, and for the fundamental survival of a way of life that was being systematically strangled. The cavalry column riding toward them, led by a man desperate to reclaim his fading national glory, was the violent instrument of a betrayal he had personally set in motion. Custer was riding toward a crisis of his own making, and he approached it with a blinding, fatal arrogance. The signs of impending disaster were heavily layered in front of him, yet he actively discarded every safeguard. Before this campaign even began, Custer had been offered a battery of Gatling guns, hand-cranked weapons capable of firing hundreds of rounds a minute. He refused them. They required heavy mule teams. They would drag through the mud and slow his rapid advance. Speed, he calculated, was his ultimate weapon. He was also offered additional cavalry companies to bolster his numbers. He declined those too. The 7th Cavalry, he believed, could handle anything on the plains alone. By the morning of June 25th, his own scouts tried to break through his delusion. Standing on a high vantage point, known as the Crow's Nest, the Arikara and Crow Scouts looked down toward the river valley. They had lived their entire lives reading this harsh landscape. What they saw made their blood run cold. The valley floor was obscured by a thick, endless haze of wood smoke rising from thousands of cooking fires. The native pony herds grazing on the distant grass were so impossibly vast, they looked like moving dark shadows sweeping across the earth. Mitch Bouye, a mixed-blood interpreter, reportedly warned that if they went down there, they would never come out. Bloody Knife, Custer's favored scout, signaled that there were enough warriors waiting below to keep them fighting for days. Custer looked at the exact same valley and refused to see a nation defending its home. He saw only a target that might escape. Convinced that the village would scatter to the winds if he waited for reinforcements under General Terry, Custer made the tactical decision that sealed the prophecy. He did not consolidate his vulnerable force. Instead, he divided his 600 tired, mud-spattered men into 3 separate battalions, intending to strike the massive village from multiple directions at once. He divided his forces to forge an anvil and a hammer, entirely blind to the sheer, crushing weight of the anvil he was about to strike. The grasshoppers from Sitting Bull's vision were finally beginning to fall. At approximately 3:00 inches the afternoon, the fatal division of the 7th Cavalry met reality. Major Marcus Reno led 3 companies, roughly 140 men, across the shallow ford of the Little Bighorn River, their horses' hooves churning the clear water into a thick, muddy slurry. Advancing into the valley toward the southern edge of the sprawling encampment, Reno ordered his men to dismount and form a skirmish line. In standard military doctrine, a cavalry charge against a village was supposed to induce panic, scattering the inhabitants into the hills, but the village did not scatter. The warriors pouring out from the hide lodges did not flee. They mounted their ponies with a coordinated speed that stunned the advancing soldiers. The Hunkpapa camp, Sitting Bull's people, absorbed the first blow, and the immediate response was driven by something far more powerful than tactical defense. It was driven by sheer, blinding grief. In the opening volleys of Reno's attack, bullets tore through the buffalo hide lodges. Among the very first to fall were the families of the Lakota. Gall, a deeply respected Hunkpapa war leader, found that 2 of his wives and 3 of his children had been killed instantly in the dirt by army crossfire. In that precise moment, Gall did not pause to mourn. Grief would belong to the aftermath. In the heat of the afternoon, there was only rage. He rallied the Hunkpapa warriors and drove them straight at Reno's skirmish line with a physical and emotional force that eyewitnesses described as overwhelming. The soldiers, their dark wool uniforms, already soaked with sweat and heavy with the dust of the plains, were forced to fall back into a stand of timber along the river bend. In the dense cottonwoods, visibility evaporated. The noise was deafening. Horses screamed in terror. Right next to Major Reno, the Arikara scout Bloody Knife, the very man who had warned Custer hours earlier, took a direct bullet through the skull. His blood and brain matter violently spattered across Reno's dirt-streaked face and uniform. Something deep inside the major broke. He issued an order to retreat to the bluffs, but unit cohesion had already evaporated. The retreat instantly devolved into a chaotic, scrambling rout. Soldiers burst from the timber in a panicked mass, forcing their exhausted horses blindly into the chest-deep current of the river. Lakota and Cheyenne warriors lined the banks, firing relentlessly into the churning muddy water, pulling soldiers from their saddles. Nearly 40 of Reno's men died in the valley and the river crossing. The surviving troopers who clawed their way up the eastern bluffs were shattered, disorganized, and leaderless in all but name. Reno's hammer had not just failed to strike, it had completely disintegrated, and with the southern threat entirely neutralized, a massive wave of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors turned their eyes northward, slipping up the ravines toward the bluffs, toward Custer. 4 miles to the north, Custer and his 5 companies, 210 men, were riding along the high ridge lines, still unaware that Reno's assault had collapsed. Looking down from the heights, Custer finally caught a clear glimpse of the sheer, sprawling enormity of the village stretching for miles. He suddenly realized he needed the one thing he had left behind with the pack train: ammunition. He ordered his adjutant, Lieutenant William Cook, to hastily scribble a dispatch. He handed it to a trumpeter, an Italian immigrant named Giovanni Martini, and sent him galloping back along the trail. The message, written in frantic cursive, read, "Come on, big village, be quick, bring packs. P.S. Bring packs." The repeated, underlined urgency of the word packs, the reserve ammunition, betrays a sudden, chilling realization. Martini spurred his horse away. He would be the last person to ever see George Armstrong Custer's command alive. From the moment that piece of paper left Cook's dirt-smudged hand, the 210 men of the 7th Cavalry passed beyond the reach of the written historical record and into the silence of the dead. Every detail of what happened next in the following 30 to 60 minutes comes not from heroic military dispatches, but from the native warriors who fought them and the forensic archaeology buried in the earth. And the earth reveals a terrifying technological paradox. As hundreds and then over 1,000 warriors flowed up the coulees and deep draws, utilizing the folds in the ground to completely mask their movement, they brought with them a devastating advantage. The 7th Cavalry was armed with the Springfield Model 1873 carbine, a single-shot, breech-loading weapon. After firing a single round, a soldier had to manually flip open the breech, extract the spent copper casing, and insert a new one. But in the sweltering 90-degree heat, under the duress of rapid fire, the copper casings expanded and jammed inside the hot chambers. Archaeologists sweeping the battlefield a century later uncovered dozens of Springfield casings with deep knife gouges scarred into their rims. These weren't the markings of men standing tall in a glorious, defiant ring. They were the desperate traces of terrified soldiers, kneeling in the dust and mud, frantically using pocket knives to pry stuck casings from useless rifles as the enemy closed in. Meanwhile, many of the Cheyenne and Lakota warriors cresting the ridges were armed with Henry and Winchester repeating rifles, lever-action weapons capable of firing 15 rounds without reloading. The entire foundational assumption of the United States Army that their superior military technology would easily subdue a primitive enemy was completely reversed on this hillside. The savages possessed overwhelming firepower. The elite cavalrymen were holding jammed pieces of iron. The trap finally snapped shut on the right flank, on a rise now known as Calhoun Hill. Companies L and C, commanded by Custer's brother-in-law, Lieutenant James Calhoun, and his brother, Tom Custer, attempted to hold a defensive skirmish line. The archaeological map of the dropped brass casings tells the final story. At first, the casings are clustered tightly together, indicating a disciplined formation of men holding their ground. Then, abruptly, the casings scatter wildly across the grass. The skirmish line did not slowly bend. It snapped. When a cavalry line is flanked and outgunned, it does not execute a fighting retreat. Unit cohesion, the singular psychological mechanism keeping 200 men from giving into primeval fear, dissolves. The men broke. Horses bolted. The soldiers turned their backs and ran, desperately trying to survive. And once a skirmish line breaks, what follows is no longer a battle. It becomes a hunt. The survivors of the collapsed right flank fell back, not in an orderly fighting retreat, but in a cascading, disorganized rush toward a dusty swell now known as Last Stand Hill. But the forensic archaeology of the battlefield explicitly rejects the legendary name of that ridge. The bone fragments and jammed carbines found in the soil do not map out a tight, defiant, defensive perimeter. The bodies were not arranged in a circle of brothers in arms standing shoulder to shoulder, firing disciplined volleys into the advancing warriors. They were scattered chaotically. Some were found isolated, dying entirely alone in the tall grass. Others were huddled in small, desperate clusters of 2 or 3. The fight was over so fast, perhaps in less than 30 minutes, that its final moments devolved entirely into brutal, close-quarters combat against lances, stone war clubs, and hatchets. Below that final rise, cutting steeply toward the hidden river, lies a harsh gash in the earth known simply as Deep Ravine. When burial details arrived days later, they found 28 bodies clustered tightly together at the bottom of this trench. These men had been running. The ravine pointed blindly toward the water, offering a desperate illusion of escape toward Reno's distant position. they never made it. Lakota and Cheyenne warriors lined the sheer upper rims of the ravine, their figures silhouetted starkly against the blazing Montana sky, and fired directly downward. The cavalrymen trapped at the bottom had absolutely nowhere to go. The steep, crumbling dirt walls offered no cover. The 28 soldiers who died in the dust of Deep Ravine likely represent the true horrific final moments of Custer's command, not standing tall on a breezy hilltop, but pinned in a lightless trench, frantically trying to reach a river they could hear but never see. By late afternoon, the gunfire faded into a heavy, lingering silence. Dust and thick gun smoke drifted aimlessly across the trampled grass. Of the 210 men who had ridden along the bluffs that morning, not a single human being remained alive. The only living creature found upright on the Custer field was a severely wounded claybank gelding named Comanche, the mount of Captain Miles Keogh. Comanche stood alone, bleeding from 7 arrows and bullets, surrounded by the naked, quiet dead. 2 days later, on June 27th, a relief column under General Alfred Terry finally crested the ridge. What the advancing scouts found was an absolute abattoir. The smell reached them long before the visual horror, the sweet, thick, suffocating stench of over 200 bodies swelling under the relentless heat of a June sun for 48 hours. Some hardened cavalrymen gagged, others pulled bandanas over their faces, refusing to move their horses forward. From a distance, the shapes scattered across the hillside looked like pale white boulders. They were not boulders. They were men, stripped completely naked, their skin bleached stark white by the sun, their limbs arranged at impossible, unnatural angles. But the physical stripping of the dead was only standard plains warfare, taking the uniforms, boots, and weapons as spoils of a victory. What was done beyond the stripping is the part of the Little Bighorn story that history books have deliberately sanitized or ignored for a century and a half. The bodies had been systematically mutilated. Scalps were taken, the skin and hair violently removed from the skull. Fingers were severed and scattered in the grass like dropped coins. Limbs were hacked away. Chests were split open and hollowed out. Faces had been struck with such immense force by heavy stone war clubs that no human feature remained, just concave, bloody ruins where faces used to be. Arrows were driven deep into the flesh of the dead. The destruction was so total that of the more than 200 dead, only 56 could be positively identified by the burial parties. Tom Custer, George's younger brother and a 2-time Medal of Honor recipient from the Civil War, was found so extensively pulverized that he was only identified by a faded Goddess of Liberty tattoo on his remaining arm. For a century, historians branded this as the ultimate proof of native savagery. But that interpretation fundamentally misunderstands the cultural reality of the plains. This was not mindless cruelty for its own sake. It was a precise, calculated theology. In Lakota and Cheyenne spiritual belief, the physical body a person carried into death was the exact body they carried into the afterlife. If a warrior was killed in battle and left whole, his spirit could hold a weapon and fight again in the next world. Therefore, mutilation was an act of spiritual warfare. It was the total disarmament of the enemy's soul. If you cut off a cavalryman's hands, he could never hold a Springfield carbine in the next life. If you crushed his eyes, he could not see to aim. If you severed his legs, he could not march. The soldiers had just fired blindly into a village filled with innocent families. Reno's charge had murdered women and children. This deliberate dismemberment was a sacred, protective duty, ensuring that these exact men could never threaten Lakota or Cheyenne families again, in this world or the next. Yet, amidst this vast landscape of spiritual execution, there was one glaring, enduring mystery. Near the top of the hill, George Armstrong Custer was found lying across 2 other soldiers. He had been stripped, naked, and he bore 2 fatal bullet wounds, one in the left temple, one in the left chest. But his body had not been scalped, and his face had not been smashed. He was left entirely intact. Some historians argue the warriors simply did not recognize him, as Custer had cut his famous golden hair short before the campaign. Others suggest his unmarred body was a mark of deep warrior respect. But in 2005, a Northern Cheyenne oral tradition publicly surfaced with a completely different narrative. It claims that a Cheyenne woman named Buffalo Calf Road Woman rode onto the field that day, not only fighting alongside the men but striking the fatal blow that knocked Custer from his horse. According to this tradition, Custer's spirit was claimed by her, protecting his physical form from further mutilation. The battle that destroyed an American military icon is simply remembered by the Cheyenne as the battle where the girl saved her brother. The news of the massacre reached the East Coast just as the United States was celebrating its centennial on the 4th of July, 1876. The shock was electric. The idea that a golden-haired hero and his elite command could be wiped out by indigenous people the government had already declared conquered was unthinkable. So, the nation did what empires always do with unthinkable disasters. They rewrote it. They turned Custer into a flawless martyr and the Lakota into bloodthirsty monsters. The propaganda paintings were commissioned, the noble last stand myth was cemented into the American psyche, and the brutal reality of the tactical collapse was completely buried. In retaliation, the United States Army flooded the plains, hunting down the scattered bands, starving them into submission, and forcing them onto the very reservations they had fought so hard to avoid. The gold in the Black Hills was taken, and the victors of the Little Bighorn were systematically erased from their own triumph. For 127 years, the battlefield monument honored only the fallen cavalrymen. It was not until 2003 that an Indian memorial was finally erected on the ridge, an overdue acknowledgement that the other side had actually existed. But Sitting Bull's bloody sacrifice at the Sundance had told the truth from the very beginning. The soldiers had fallen into the camp exactly like grasshoppers without ears, deaf to every warning, driven by their own blinding hubris into an inescapable trap. George Armstrong Custer rode into the Little Bighorn searching for political glory, newspaper headlines, and eternal fame. What he found instead was an altar in the grass, a waiting prophecy, and a deeply spiritual execution that a century of lies could never fully wash away. If you are fascinated by the dark, untold details behind history's most famous events, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We unearth these stories every week.